The animal, its eyes now fixed on the daughter's petrified figure, turned. The elderly woman was no longer in danger, only the villain, paralyzed by fear and incomprehension. With a single, devastating headbutt, the bull obliterated the woman's luxury car, crushing the metal and shattering the glass in a spectacle of primal fury. There was no blood, only the deafening sound of destruction and the icy terror that seized the woman, who watched her fortune and future crumble under nature's brute force, while the bull, the unexpected guardian, remained vigilant beside the elderly woman, a protective force against human cruelty. The metallic screech of twisted steel and the crystalline rain of shattered glass echoed through the gorge, a brutal symphony sealing a woman's fate. The villain, once so secure in her bubble of privilege, watched, wide-eyed, the twisted carcass of what had been her luxury car. It wasn't just a crumpled vehicle. It was the symbol of her impunity, her superiority, her future, now reduced to a shapeless mass of metal and carbon fiber. Terror was no longer a distant possibility. It was a palpable reality, cold and sharp as the glass shards glinting dangerously on the ground. She stumbled backward, her mind a whirlwind of denial and dread. How? How could an animal, a mere pasture bull, have thwarted her meticulously orchestrated plan? Where was the logic? Where was the predictability of the world she so skillfully manipulated? The inheritance, the freedom, a life of luxury without the shadow of her invalid mother. Everything seemed to vanish like smoke before that colossal, unpredictable creature. The bull, Monarcha, with sharp horns and flaming eyes, did not move. It remained there, between the elderly woman in the wheelchair and the petrified daughter, a wall of muscle and contained fury. Its heavy breathing, a guttural and constant sound, was the only noise that dared to challenge the stunned silence that had settled. The urgency of imminent falling danger was gone, but the tension was even denser, more suffocating. It was the tension between untamed nature and human cruelty, a primordial confrontation unfolding at the edge of the abyss. The elderly woman, still pale and trembling, raised a weak hand, touching the bull's rough hide, a gesture of silent gratitude, of recognition for that divine intervention, or perhaps a last vestige of sanity amidst the chaos. Her eyes, once filled with terror, now reflected a complex mixture of relief and a strange admiration for her unexpected savior. She did not speak, did not scream, only watched, as if witnessing a spectacle that defied all comprehension. The daughter, however, could not tear her gaze from the bull. It was the personification of her failure, the guardian of her ruin. Every nerve in her body screamed for her to run, to flee that nightmare. But where? Her car, her only escape route, was unrecognizable. The fence, which should have contained it, lay in pieces, and the abyss, which should have been her mother's tomb, now seemed a mirror of her own uncertain future. A flash of desperation and rage ignited in the villain's eyes. She couldn't simply accept defeat. She couldn't let an animal ruin everything. With a hoarse cry, more of frustration than courage, she snatched a sharp piece of rock from the ground and took a hesitant step forward. Her plan was absurd, suicidal, but logic had abandoned that scene. She needed to act, to regain control, even if it meant facing her own death. The bull, as if sensing her murderous intent, lowered its head, scraping the ground with a front hoof. A deep, grave sound emerged from its throat, an unmistakable warning. It was no circus animal, no pet. It was a force of nature, a wild spirit awakened to fulfill a purpose. The daughter froze again, the stone heavy in her hand. The air seemed thin, each breath a struggle. She was trapped between the bull's fury and the precipice, between the life she wanted to steal and the death that now stalked her. The surrounding landscape, once an idyllic scene of mountains and valleys, transformed into a trap, a stage for her judgment. The sun, which had once shone with the promise of a perfect day, now seemed to mock her, its golden rays illuminating the scene of her disgrace. The breeze blowing from the abyss carried with it the smell of earth, rock, and an ancestral fear. The elderly woman, observing her daughter with an expression that was a mixture of pity and resignation, seemed the only figure at peace in that instant, protected by the imposing shadow of her guardian. The daughter, her heart beating wildly, felt the weight of that gaze, not just the bull's, but her mother's, a look that seemed to say, "You failed. And now, what will you do?" The stone slipped from her fingers, falling with a dull thud to the earth. Her mind, once so sharp and calculating, was in tatters. Reality was a crushing blow. She was no longer the predator, she was the prey. And the bull, the black giant, did not seem to have finished its mission. Its eyes, fixed on her, promised that the night was still far from over. The stone, an insignificant piece of rock, lay on the ground, a mute testament to the woman's impotent fury. Her fingers tingled, not from the effort of holding it, but from the shock of surrender. Her mind, once a labyrinth of cold strategies and calculations, was now a battlefield of panic and despair. The bull, monarcha of sharp horns, did not move, but its presence was a gravitational force, pulling all the air to itself, leaving her breathless. The animal's eyes, deep and dark as night itself, were mirrors where she saw reflected her own insignificance, her cruelty exposed and judged. The silence that followed the stone's fall was more deafening than any scream. It was the sound of the world stopping to witness the reversal of roles. The predator, now prey, trembled. It wasn't the chill of the abyss breeze, but the icy cold of terror seeping into her bones. She tried to swallow, but her throat was dry, scratchy. Every muscle in her body screamed for escape, but to where? Her car, once a sanctuary of luxury and power, was now a twisted mass of metal, a monument to the bull's fury. The fence, which should have been a barrier, lay in pieces, an open invitation to danger. And the abyss, oh, the abyss, which should have been her mother's tomb, now seemed a mirror of her own imminent fate. The bull, as if reading her innermost thoughts, let out a heavy snort, a guttural sound that vibrated the ground beneath her feet. A cloud of vapor escaped its nostrils, dense and menacing in the thin air. Then, with a deliberate slowness that was more terrifying than any sudden attack, it took a step, a single step, heavy, determined. The ground trembled slightly, a seismic warning of the force contained within that colossal body. The woman instinctively recoiled, her frantic eyes searching for an escape route. To her right, the destroyed car. To her left, the broken fence and open pasture, but the bull blocked any path to safety. Behind her, nothingness, the precipice that would swallow anyone who dared to challenge it. The bull took another step. And another. It wasn't a charge, not a lunge. It was a relentless march. Each movement calculated to maximize terror. It wasn't attacking, it was cornering. It was pushing her slowly, inexorably, towards the edge of the abyss. The irony was cruel, a slow poison spreading through her veins. She would be forced to face the same fate she had planned for her mother. Panic rose in her throat, a silent scream refusing to be released. Her lungs burned. Oxygen seemed to refuse entry. The mother in her wheelchair watched everything with a strange, almost supernatural calm. Her eyes, once filled with terror, now held a complex mixture of relief, resignation, and perhaps, just perhaps, a hint of satisfaction. She did not speak, did not move, merely witnessed the judgment unfolding. The imposing figure of the bull, her unexpected guardian, cast a protective shadow over her, while the daughter was exposed to the cruel sunlight, her face pale and distorted by fear. The bull continued its slow, methodical advance. The woman felt the earth give way slightly under her heels. She was at the edge. There was nowhere left to go. The wind from the abyss whipped her hair, an icy reminder of the imminent fall. Her eyes, wide with horror, met the bull's again. There was no hatred there, only a cold, ancestral determination. It was not an executioner driven by human emotions. It was a force of nature, an instrument of a cosmic balance she had dared to disturb. A low, guttural sound emerged from the bull's throat, more a warning than a roar. Its horns, sharp and menacing, lowered slightly, pointing towards the woman. She could feel the heat of its heavy breath, the smell of earth and wild animal. The world narrowed to her, the bull and the precipice, luxury, inheritance, power. All dissolved into smoke, replaced by the brutal reality of her own mortality. She was just flesh and bone, fragile and insignificant before that creature. The daughter, now literally at the edge of the abyss, her heart beating like a war drum in her chest, felt the ground vibrate again. The bull did not stop. It continued to approach, not to push her, but to block any movement, any hope of escape. It cornered her, not with violence, but with its mere overwhelming presence. Its eyes, once so full of arrogance, now reflected pure and absolute terror. She was trapped. No car, no escape route, no hope. The night was still far from over, and the bull, the monarcha of that gorge, seemed to have only just begun its lesson. The woman's breath was a harsh, ragged sound, rasping in her dry throat. The thin air of the abyss seemed to refuse to fill her lungs, each inhalation a struggle against the panic that choked her. Her eyes, wide and bloodshot, swept the landscape for an exit that didn't exist. To her right, the twisted metal of what had been her luxury car, a cruel reminder of her failure and the indomitable force confronting her. To her left, the shattered fence, a portal to freedom that the bull blocked with its imposing mass. And behind her, the void, the abyss, the promise of an end she had destined for another. Monica, with a disturbing calm, stopped mere inches from her. There was no charge, no attack, only presence. A mountain of muscle and black hide, exhaling an animal heat that contrasted with the icy cold of the fear invading her. Its horns, sharp and polished by time, seemed like keen blades, pointing at nothing, yet carrying an implicit threat that chilled the soul. The bull's eyes, deep and dark as bottomless pits, fixed on her. There was no uncontrolled fury, no hatred. There was something older, more primordial, a silent judgment, a cosmic scale weighing her actions and condemning her. She smelled the damp earth, the animal sweat, the salty breeze rising from the precipice. All her senses were heightened to an extreme, transforming each sensation into torment. Her mind, once so calculating and cold, was now a whirlwind of fragmented images, the cynical smile while planning the inheritance, the indifference at seeing her mother waste away, the final push of the wheelchair. Everything returned, not as regret, but as irrefutable proof of her own ruin. The mother in her wheelchair remained motionless, her fragile figure under the bull's protective shadow. Her eyes, once filled with terror, now held an almost supernatural serenity. It was as if she had found peace in chaos, justice in savagery. There was no triumph in her gaze, only a quiet acceptance of the unfolding fate. For the daughter, her mother's silence was more deafening than any scream, more accusatory than any word. It was the silence of one witnessing a reckoning with no need to intervene. The sun, beginning to dip towards the horizon, cast long, distorted shadows over the gorge, painting the sky with shades of orange and purple. The beauty of the landscape was a cruel contrast to the unfolding drama. The breeze, once refreshing, now seemed to whisper ancient secrets, tales of retribution and of natural forces that could not be challenged with impunity. The bull, Monarcha, let out a heavy snort, a sound that vibrated the earth beneath the woman's feet. It was not a sound of attack, but of warning. of patience wearing thin. It scraped a front hoof on the ground, not with the fury of a charge, but with the precision of one marking its territory, establishing boundaries. Each grain of raised earth seemed a countdown to an uncertain fate. The daughter closed her eyes for an instant, wishing it all a nightmare, a hallucination. But when she opened them again, reality was even sharper, crueler. The bull was there, her mother was there, and the abyss was there. She was trapped in a purgatory at the edge of the precipice, her future suspended on a razor's edge. Luxury, power, inheritance, everything she had coveted and for which she had betrayed her own flesh and blood, vanished into smoke, replaced by the brutal reality of her own insignificance. She was no longer the predator. She was the prey, and the predator, with its night-dark eyes and steel horns, did not seem to have finished its lesson. Monica took a lateral step, a subtle movement that, nonetheless, made her dangerously sway at the edge. It wasn't a push, but a reminder of her precariousness, her utter lack of control. The wind from the abyss howled like a chorus of ancient spirits celebrating imminent justice. The daughter, her mind in tatters, realized the bull wouldn't push her. It would leave her there at the edge to feel every second of her own terror, to confront the void she herself had created. The lesson wasn't about physical death, but about the annihilation of the soul, about the loss of everything she valued, and the understanding that in the grand scheme of things, she was merely a grain of sand at the mercy of forces far greater than her petty ambition. Monica, guardian of that gorge, waited. And the night, indeed, was only just beginning. Monica took a lateral step, a subtle movement that nonetheless made her dangerously sway at the edge. It wasn't a push, but a reminder of her precariousness, her utter lack of control. The wind from the abyss howled like a chorus of ancient spirits celebrating imminent justice. The daughter, her mind in tatters, realized the bull wouldn't push her. It would leave her there, at the edge, to feel every second of her own terror, to confront the void she herself had created. The lesson wasn't about physical death, but about the annihilation of the soul, about the loss of everything she valued, and the understanding that in the grand scheme of things, she was merely a grain of sand at the mercy of forces far greater than her petty ambition. The bull then slowly lowered its head, its eyes fixed on hers. There was no threat of goring, but the pure, overwhelming presence of its massive forehead, a wall of flesh and bone that blocked any view beyond it. It was as if it were forcing her to look within herself, into the void she had become. The smell of earth and crushed grass, mingled with the animal's sweat, filled her nostrils, a primal fragrance that reminded her of her own fragility. The sun was now almost touching the horizon, and shadows deepened, swallowing the gorge in a cloak of impending darkness. The night's chill began to settle, but what made her tremble was not the temperature, but the certainty that darkness would bring with it a new dimension of terror. Monica, guardian of that gorge, waited, and the night indeed was only just beginning. The bull, Monica, lowered its head, not in a gesture of imminent threat, but with the deliberate slowness of one imposing an undeniable truth. Its eyes, once bottomless pits, now reflected the last rays of sun, glinting with an ancestral intelligence that seemed to read the woman's soul. The massive forehead, a shield of flesh and bone, blocked her view of the abyss, forcing her to confront only the deep darkness of the animal's eyes, a mirror to the void she carried within herself. The smell of damp earth, crushed grass, and animal sweat, a primal and potent fragrance, filled her nostrils, suffocating her with the memory of her own fragility. The sun, a flaming disk, now plunged into the horizon, painting the sky with blood-red and deep purple hues. The shadows, once long and distorted, transformed into a dense cloak that swallowed the gorge, erasing colors and revealing menacing contours. The night's chill, an icy shiver, began to settle. But what made her tremble was not the temperature, but the certainty that darkness would bring with it a new dimension of terror, a stage where her worst fears would come to life. The daughter, her body paralyzed by panic, felt the ground beneath her feet begin to give way slightly, tiny grains of earth detaching and falling into the void. It was a cruel reminder of her precariousness, of how she was suspended by a thread, at the mercy of forces she could never control. Her eyes, wide open, tried to pierce the growing gloom, searching for any foothold, any sign of hope, but found only the dark vastness and the bull's imposing figure. Her mind, once so sharp and calculating, was now a labyrinth of fragmented and desperate thoughts. She tried to rationalize, to find logic, an escape plan. But there was no logic in what was happening, only primordial savagery, undeniable retribution. Luxury, power, inheritance, everything for which she had sacrificed her humanity, now seemed a distant mirage, devoid of any real value. She was no longer the predator. She was the prey, cornered, with the predator observing every breath, every tremor. The mother, in her wheelchair, remained in her supernatural stillness. In the advancing gloom, her figure seemed even more ethereal, almost an apparition. Her eyes, now just faint glimmers in the darkness, expressed neither fear nor triumph, only a deep serenity, an acceptance that was, for the daughter, more terrifying than any cry of condemnation. It was the silence of one witnessing a reckoning, with no need to intervene, letting nature, in its brutal wisdom, deliver justice. Monica let out a low snort, a sound that vibrated the earth and reverberated in the woman's chest, not as a roar of fury, but as the heavy sigh of an ancient being observing the futility of human ambition. It scraped its front hoof on the ground again, the dry, dragging sound a clock ticking down the last moments of her false security. Each raised grain of earth seemed a countdown to an uncertain fate. The abyss breeze, once a whisper, now howled louder, a chorus of invisible voices that seemed to celebrate imminent retribution. She felt the wind whip her hair, the cold penetrate her bones, and a sense of absolute helplessness invaded her. There was no one to hear her, no one to save her. Her world of privilege and control had crumbled, and she was alone, confronted with the insignificance of her own existence. The bull then took a step back, a subtle movement that reopened the view of the abyss. The darkness below was total, an unfathomable void that seemed to suck in light itself. The daughter staggered, her heart pounding in her chest, her throat dry. She realized Monica wouldn't push her. It would leave her there at the edge, to feel every second of her own terror, to confront the void she herself had created in her relentless pursuit of power and wealth. The lesson wasn't about physical death, but about the annihilation of the soul, about the loss of everything she valued, and the understanding that, in the grand scheme of things, she was merely a grain of sand at the mercy of forces far greater than her petty ambition. Night had fully fallen. Stars began to speckle the black sky, indifferent to the drama unfolding below. Monica, guardian of that gorge, waited, and the daughter, trapped between the bull and the abyss, realized that the night indeed was only just beginning, and that true terror was yet to come. The darkness of the abyss, now fully exposed, swallowed the last vestige of the daughter's light and hope. She staggered, her entire body in a spasm of terror, her hands clawing at the cold air for something to grasp, but finding only emptiness. Her heart pounded against her ribs, a drum of panic echoing in the oppressive silence of the night. Her throat was dry, raw, and any sound she tried to emit was lost in a suffocating gasp. The night's cold intensified, biting her exposed skin, penetrating her expensive clothes that now seemed mere rags. Every fiber of her being craved warmth, shelter, anything that could pull her away from that icy edge. But Monica remained there, an imposing silhouette against the starry sky, its dark eyes fixed on her. like two black holes observing her agony. It did not move, did not attack. It simply existed, and that existence was a torture in itself. She tried to speak, to plead, to scream, but the words formed in her mind only to die in a hoarse whisper. Fear had paralyzed her vocal cords, transforming her into a statue of terror. The smell of earth and animal sweat, once merely a presence, now seemed to suffocate her, a constant reminder of her vulnerability and nature's indomitable force. The daughter closed her eyes again, wishing with all her soul for the nightmare to end. But the darkness behind her eyelids was even more terrifying, filled with images of her own deeds, her cruelty, her unbridled ambition. When she opened them, the bull was still there, her mother was still there, and the abyss was still there, deeper and darker than ever. Monica, with an almost theatrical slowness, tilted its head slightly to the side, a movement that wasn't threatening, but carried immense gravity. It was as if it were assessing her, weighing her soul, deciding the next step in its lesson. The daughter felt a shiver run down her spine, an icy premonition that the bull wouldn't let her fall, but would make her wish for the fall. The true punishment wouldn't be death, but life at the edge of the precipice, the eternal confrontation with the void she had created. The night, with its shadows and secrets, was only just beginning to reveal its depths. The night, with its shadows and secrets, was only beginning to reveal its depths, and the daughter, trapped between Monica and the abyss, felt each of these secrets infiltrate her soul. The cold, once merely an uncomfortable sensation, transformed into a searing pain that seemed to freeze the blood in her veins. Each gust of wind rising from the precipice was an invisible whip, lashing against her skin, tearing away the last vestige of warmth and comfort. She trembled uncontrollably, her teeth chattering in a frantic rhythm that echoed the panic in her chest. The luxury of her clothes, once a shield against the world, was now a cruel irony, unable to protect her from nature's brutality or the coldness of her own fate. Monica, in turn, remained motionless, a colossal statue of darkness and power. Its eyes, once mere distant glimmers, now seemed to absorb the faint starlight, transforming into unfathomable pits that stared at her unblinking. There was no explicit rage in its gaze, no uncontrolled fury, only an ancestral patience, the calm of a judge who had already passed sentence and now observed the execution. This absence of emotion, this calculating indifference, was even more terrifying than any attack. It didn't need to roar or charge. Its mere presence was a condemnation, a constant reminder of her insignificance. The daughter tried to move, a desperate impulse to flee, to get away from that treacherous edge. But her feet seemed nailed to the ground, her muscles stiff and aching, refusing to obey. Fear was an overwhelming weight, paralyzing every fiber of her being, transforming her into a helpless spectator of her own misfortune. She looked at her mother, perhaps seeking a trace of compassion, a sign that this torture might end. But her mother, in the wheelchair, was a sphinx in the darkness, her stillness an impenetrable barrier. Her eyes, once faint glimmers, now seemed to reflect the immensity of the starry sky, as if she were in communion with something far greater, far older than petty human ambition. There was no forgiveness, no condemnation, only the silent acceptance of a cycle completing itself. The smell of damp earth and animal sweat, once merely a note in the air, now intensified, suffocating her, filling her lungs with a wild and primordial fragrance. It was the smell of life and death, of untamed nature she had tried to dominate and that now subjugated her. She tasted the bitter tang of panic in her mouth, her throat dry and raw, unable to emit a sound that wasn't a choked whimper. Her hands, once so accustomed to holding crystal goblets and signing million-dollar checks, now clutched at the cold, loose earth, seeking a support that didn't exist. A security that had dissolved. Suddenly, a sound. Not a roar, but a stronger, deeper snort from Monica. It wasn't a sound of anger, but of heavy displeasure, almost a lament. And then the bull made a subtle, almost imperceptible movement. It neither advanced nor retreated. It merely tilted its head slightly to the side, and its horns, once pointed forward, now seemed to align with the horizon line, pointing into the void. It wasn't a gesture of direct threat, but a suggestion, a silent question. It was as if it were showing her the way, inviting her to contemplate the choice she herself had forged. The daughter felt the ground beneath her feet tremble. It wasn't an earthquake, but the vibration of the precipice itself, as if the earth were tired of supporting her. Small stones and grains of sand began to detach from the edge, falling into the abyss with an almost inaudible whisper, a constant reminder of the fragility of her position. She closed her eyes again, but the images of the darkness below, of the destroyed car, and of her mother's serene gaze were etched in her mind, more vivid than ever. She couldn't escape, not even in her own mind. Monarcha then took a lateral step, a slow and deliberate movement that made her hold her breath. It wasn't a step towards her, but one that revealed even more of the abyss's vastness, opening a chasm in the darkness that seemed to swallow light itself. The daughter staggered, her balance precarious, and for an instant gravity seemed to pull her with an irresistible force. She didn't fall, but the sensation of almost falling, of being at the brink of nothingness, was more terrifying than falling itself. It was the promise of an end that wouldn't come quickly, but would be prolonged, agonizing, a macabre dance with the void. Night deepened, and the stars, indifferent to human drama, shone with a cold, distant intensity. Monarcha, guardian of that gorge, was not an executioner, but a mirror, reflecting back to her the darkness she had cultivated in her own soul. And the daughter, trapped between the bull and the abyss, realized that true terror was not death, but life at the edge of the precipice, the eternal confrontation with the void she had created, a punishment that would extend for an eternity of seconds under nature's silent and relentless gaze. The lesson, she realized with a chill that froze her soul, was only just beginning. The cold was no longer just a physical sensation. It was a living entity, an invisible predator infiltrating every cell of her body, sucking out life, hope, the very will to exist. Her lips were cracked, her tongue heavy and rough, and each breath was a painful effort, tearing at her already dry throat. Tears, if any remained, had frozen in her eyes, blurring her vision into a murky smear of darkness and distant stars. She tried to wiggle her toes, a pathetic test of her own autonomy, but they were numb, inert, as if detached from her body. The wealthy heiress, accustomed to having her every whim met with a snap of her fingers, was now reduced to a trembling, impotent mass, at the mercy of a bull and nature's relentless indifference. Monarcha, in turn, seemed to have merged with the night itself. Its massive silhouette was almost invisible against the backdrop of dark rocks and a moonless sky, save for the two luminous points of its eyes, which seemed to burn with an inner light, an ancestral wisdom that observed her without judgment, but with desolate clarity. It was the personification of patience, the silent guardian of a boundary she had dared to cross. In her mind, a whirlwind of images clashed. The luxurious dinners, exotic trips, glittering jewels, the empty laughter of self-serving friends. Everything now seemed so distant, so futile, so devoid of meaning. She had built her life on a foundation of gold and ego, and now that foundation crumbled beneath her feet, revealing the void below. She thought of her mother, the woman she had despised and manipulated, the figure now just meters away in her wheelchair, a silent witness to her downfall. Was there a flicker of regret, a pang of guilt? No. Only bitter resentment, an impotent rage at being caught, at her plan having failed so spectacularly. She still saw herself as the victim, the wronged one, even at the brink of annihilation. This was her true curse, the inability to see beyond herself, to recognize humanity in others, to feel empathy. Monica, as if having read her innermost thoughts, let out another snort. This time the sound was longer, deeper, almost a resonant lament that vibrated in the cold air and was lost in the abyss. And then it made a move. Not an attack, not a charge, but a slow, calculated lateral step that made her hold her breath. Its horns, once aligned with the horizon, now moved slightly downward, scraping the ground with a harsh, dry sound. It was a sound of friction, of stone against earth, but to her it sounded like the creak of a coffin lid closing. What was it doing? She couldn't understand. It wasn't pushing her, but it wasn't freeing her either. It held her there in an icy, endless purgatory. The ground beneath her feet, already unstable, now seemed to give way even more. Small stones rolled into the abyss with alarming frequency, each a reminder of the precariousness of her existence. She felt the cold, damp earth in her hands, the smell of minerals and decay, a fragrance that once would have made her recoil in disgust, but which now was the only real thing, the only thing anchoring her to that plane of existence. Her eyes, wide with terror, fixed on Monarca's horns, which now seemed sharper, more menacing, even in their stillness. They were not weapons of blind fury, but instruments of slow, deliberate justice, shaped by nature to impose its own laws. She felt an overwhelming vertigo, not just from the abyss, but from reality itself distorting around her. The mother, in her wheelchair, remained an enigmatic figure. Her eyes, fixed on the horizon, seemed to see something beyond human comprehension, something the daughter, in her pettiness, could never grasp. There was not a shred of triumph in her posture, nor a hint of vengeance, only a disturbing serenity, as if she were at peace with fate, whatever it might be. This indifference, this acceptance, was almost as terrifying as the bull's presence. The daughter, in her selfishness, expected a reaction, an emotion, anything that could validate her own existence, even if it was hatred. But there was nothing, only the void. Night deepened, and the stars, once distant, now seemed closer, brighter, like millions of eyes observing the grim spectacle. The wind howled a mournful melody, and the cold became unbearable, penetrating to the marrow of her bones. Monica then made another movement, even more subtle than the last. It didn't move, but its eyes, previously fixed on her, now shifted slightly to the mother's wheelchair. It was a brief, almost imperceptible gaze, yet laden with a meaning the daughter couldn't decipher. Was it a look of recognition, of protection, or something deeper, a connection to nature she had long lost? She felt a different kind of shiver, not from cold, but from an incipient understanding, a spark of perception that threatened to ignite her mind. The bull wasn't there just to punish her. It was there to protect, to restore a balance she had tried to break. And the mother, in her stillness, was an integral part of that balance. She felt like an intruder in an ancient ritual, a desecrator of a sacred sanctuary. The air seemed to vibrate with a primordial energy, a force she, in her arrogance, had underestimated. Monica, with its imposing presence, was not just an animal. It was an emissary, a judge, a guardian of a world she had forgotten. The lesson wasn't just about death or life, but about the interconnectedness of all things, about respect for nature, for life, for existence itself. And she, in her selfish pursuit of power, had violated all these laws. The night's cold, the wind's howl, the smell of earth, the bull's silent gaze, the mother's stillness, all combined in a symphony of terror and revelation. She stood at the edge of the abyss, not just physical, but existential, confronting the rawest, stripped-down version of herself, divested of all her riches and privileges. And the night, with its indifferent stars, promised an eternity of seconds for this lesson to be etched into her soul. Monarca, with a final snort that seemed to seal her fate, remained motionless, a living monument to retribution. Eternity stretched in frozen seconds, each heavier than the last. Monarcha, a monument of flesh and mystery, remained motionless, its silhouette merged with the night's darkness, save for its eyes that burned like live coals, fixed on the daughter. She, in turn, was petrified, a block of ice and terror at the edge of the abyss. The cold was no longer a sensation, it was a torture, an invisible predator gnawing at her insides, sucking life from every cell. Her lips cracked, her tongue heavy and rough, each breath a painful tear in her dry throat. Tears, long since frozen, had blurred her vision into a murky smear, where distant stars seemed like pinpricks of light, piercing a veil of darkness. She tried to wiggle her toes, a pathetic gesture of resistance, but they were numb, inert, as if detached from her body. The wealthy heiress, accustomed to having her every whim met with a snap of her fingers, was now reduced to a trembling, impotent mass, at the mercy of a bull and nature's relentless indifference. In her mind, a whirlwind of images clashed: the luxurious dinners, exotic trips, glittering jewels, the empty laughter of self-serving friends. Everything now seemed so distant, so futile, so devoid of meaning. Her life, built on a foundation of gold and ego, crumbled beneath her feet, revealing the void below. She thought of her mother, the woman she had despised and manipulated, the figure now just meters away in her wheelchair, a silent witness to her downfall. Was there a flicker of regret? A pang of guilt? No. Only bitter resentment, an impotent rage at being caught, at her plan having failed so spectacularly. She still saw herself as the victim, the wronged one, even at the brink of annihilation. This was her true curse, the inability to see beyond herself, to recognize humanity in others, to feel empathy. Night deepened, and the stars, once distant, now seemed closer, brighter, like millions of eyes observing the grim spectacle. The wind howled a mournful melody, and the cold became unbearable, penetrating to the marrow of her bones. Monarcha then made another movement, even more subtle than the last. It didn't move, but its eyes, previously fixed on her, now shifted slightly to the mother's wheelchair. It was a brief, almost imperceptible gaze, yet laden with a meaning the daughter couldn't decipher. Was it a look of recognition, of protection, or something deeper, a connection to nature she had long lost? She felt a different kind of shiver, not from cold, but from an incipient understanding, a spark of perception that threatened to ignite her mind. The bull wasn't there just to punish her, it was there to protect, to restore a balance she had tried to break. And the mother, in her stillness, was an integral part of that balance. She felt like an intruder in an ancient ritual, a desecrator of a sacred sanctuary. The air seemed to vibrate with a primordial energy, a force she, in her arrogance, had underestimated. Monarcha, with its imposing presence, was not just an animal. It was an emissary, a judge, a guardian of a world she had forgotten. The lesson wasn't just about death or life, but about the interconnectedness of all things, about respect for nature, for life, for existence itself. And she, in her selfish pursuit of power, had violated all these laws. The night's cold, the wind's howl, the smell of earth, the bull's silent gaze, the mother's stillness, all combined in a symphony of terror and revelation. She stood at the edge of the abyss, not just physical, but existential, confronting the rawest, stripped-down version of herself, divested of all her riches and privileges. And the night, with its indifferent stars, promised an eternity of seconds for this lesson to be etched into her soul. Monarcha, with a final snort that seemed to seal her fate, remained motionless, a living monument to retribution. Suddenly, Monarcha took a step, a single, heavy step forward, not towards the daughter, but to the side, closer to the edge of the precipice. The ground trembled under the impact of its massive hoof, and, to the daughter's horror, a thin, jagged crack appeared in the soil, extending from the bull's hoof directly towards her, like a dark vein in the earth. The crack stopped inches from her shoes, an invisible yet palpable dividing line between life and nothingness. The daughter's heart leaped to her throat, beating like a frantic drum. She needed no words to understand the message. The earth beneath her feet was as fragile as her own existence. One false move, one more tremor, and she would be swallowed. Monica then slowly lowered its head, its horns now pointing to the ground, almost touching the icy earth. It wasn't a gesture of threat, but of contemplation, as if measuring the depth of the abyss, or perhaps the depth of the woman's soul before it. A low, guttural sound escaped its throat, a deep murmur that seemed to come from the very bowels of the mountain. It was not anger nor fury, but an ancestral voice, a lament for the disharmony she had caused. The daughter felt the air thin in her lungs, and panic seized her. She could no longer breathe, no longer think. The world around her became a blur of darkness and terror. And the only real thing was the crack in the ground, the imminent promise of her own annihilation. The lesson, she realized, was deepening, engraving itself not just in her mind, but in every fiber of her being, an indelible mark of her transgression. The crack in the ground was not just a line in the earth, it was a scar, a deep cut in the reality she knew, extending like a grim omen directly to her feet. It stopped mere inches from her designer shoes, an invisible yet insurmountable boundary between what was and what was about to cease to be. The daughter's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic, erratic rhythm that echoed in her ears, drowning out the wind's howl and the distant murmur of the abyss. She needed no words to understand the message etched in that fissure. The earth beneath her was as fragile as her own existence, as precarious as the morality she had discarded. One false move, one more tremor, and she would be swallowed, not just by the darkness of the precipice, but by the void she herself had cultivated. Monica then slowly lowered its head, its massive horns now pointing to the ground, almost touching the icy earth. It wasn't a gesture of explicit threat, but of deep contemplation, as if measuring not only the depth of the abyss, but the depth of the woman's soul before it. A low, guttural sound escaped its throat, a deep murmur that seemed to come from the very bowels of the mountain, an ancestral lament that vibrated in the cold air and infiltrated every cell of her body. It was not anger nor fury, but a voice of millennia, a lament for the disharmony she had caused, for the life she had tried to extinguish. The daughter felt the air thin in her lungs, and panic, once a wave, was now a tsunami, dragging her to the bottom of an ocean of terror. She could no longer breathe, no longer think. The world around her became a blur of darkness and terror, and the only real thing was the crack in the ground, the imminent promise of her own annihilation. The lesson, she realized, was deepening, engraving itself not just in her mind, but in every fiber of her being, an indelible mark of her transgression. The night's cold, once a physical sensation, transformed into an existential chill, an echo of her own heart's coldness. Each succeeding second was an eternity of agony. Monica remained motionless, its head lowered, its horns almost grazing the earth, like a sculptor waiting for the clay to dry to reveal its final work. Its eyes, once live coals, now seemed like pits of darkness, absorbing all light and hope. The daughter, paralyzed, felt her blood run cold in her veins, her muscles stiff as stone. She tried to swallow, but her throat was dry and raw, like sandpaper. The smell of damp earth and minerals, mixed with the bull's wild odor, filled her nostrils, a primal fragrance that anchored her to that nightmare. In her mind, images of her life of luxury and excess clashed with the rawness of that moment. The opulent dinners, Exotic trips, glittering jewels, everything now seemed a grotesque farce, a thin veil covering an abyssal void. She had built her life on the premise that money and power could buy everything, even nature's submission and the silence of conscience. But there, at the edge of the abyss, stripped of everything, she confronted the naked truth. There were laws money couldn't break, forces human power couldn't dominate. The mother, in her wheelchair, continued to be the most enigmatic figure of all. Her eyes fixed on the horizon, her unwavering serenity, were a mirror reflecting the daughter's turbulence. There was not a shred of triumph in her posture, nor a trace of vengeance, only a quiet acceptance, a peace that the daughter, in her pettiness, could never comprehend. This indifference, this absence of emotion, was almost as terrifying as the bull's presence. The daughter, in her selfishness, expected a reaction, a scream, a tear, anything that could validate her own existence, even if it was hatred. But there was nothing. Only the void, and that void was the heaviest of all burdens. Monica, its head still lowered, made an almost imperceptible movement. Its horns, which once seemed mere instruments of threat, now became symbols of relentless justice. They were not weapons of blind fury, but instruments of slow, deliberate retribution, shaped by nature to impose its own laws. The daughter felt an overwhelming vertigo, not just from the abyss, but from reality itself, distorting around her. The lesson wasn't just about death or life, but about the interconnectedness of all things, about respect for nature, for life, for existence itself. And she, in her selfish pursuit of power, had violated all these laws. The wind howled a mournful melody, and the cold became unbearable, penetrating to the marrow of her bones. Monica then raised its head, its eyes fixed again on the daughter. This time there was no anger, but a depth of understanding that made her tremble. It was as if it could see through her soul, unraveling every layer of selfishness and cruelty. It was not just an animal. It was an emissary, a judge, a guardian of a world she had forgotten. And the eternity of seconds promised by the night was only just beginning to engrave its lesson upon her soul. Monica, its head held high, was no longer a furious beast, but a primordial mirror, reflecting the daughter's soul in all its ugliness. Its eyes, once embers, were now abysses of ancestral wisdom, unraveling every veil of arrogance and cruelty she had woven throughout her life. There was no explicit judgment, only a comprehension so vast and profound that it made her tremble, not from cold, but from an icy truth that seeped into her bones. It saw, she knew, the rotten essence of her ambition, the emptiness of her heart, the extent of her transgression. The eternity of seconds promised by the night was not a metaphor. It was the relentless reality of her condemnation, engraving every flaw, every selfishness, every act of inhumanity upon her soul. The air grew dense, heavy with revelation. The daughter felt the ground spin, not from the physical abyss, but from the moral abyss opening beneath her feet. Images of her life, once a glorious parade of achievements and pleasures, now twisted into a gallery of horrors. Humiliated maids, fraudulent businesses, discarded friends, used lovers, and above all her mother, always her mother, relegated to an object, an impediment, a means to an end. Each memory was a stab, each empty laugh, a silent scream from her own conscience. She had built an empire on the ruins of empathy, and now that empire crumbled, brick by brick, under Monarca's impassive gaze. The crack in the ground, which once seemed a physical threat, transformed into a vivid representation of the fracture in her own psyche. It was not just a line in the earth, it was the dividing line between who she thought she was and who she truly was. Inches from her designer shoes, the fissure seemed to mock her vanity, her pretense of control. The luxury that defined her was now a cruel joke. armor that could not protect her from the truth. Monarca, still motionless, let out a soft snort, almost a sigh. It was not a sound of anger, but of resignation, of a deep sorrow that seemed to echo the pain of 1,000 generations. It was the sound of nature lamenting the loss of one of its children, the corruption of a soul that should have been a guardian. This sound, more than any roar, broke the last barrier of her denial. Warm, bitter tears began to stream down her face, not tears of genuine regret, but of self-pity, of terror at the imminent loss, of a painful understanding that she had become the villain of her own story. Her eyes, clouded by salt water, shifted from the bull to meet her mother's. The mother's stillness was a paradox, a force the daughter couldn't decipher. There was no condemnation in the maternal gaze, nor forgiveness, only a serene acceptance, a peace that transcended fear and anger. It was as if the mother had already been through it all, had understood the lesson long before, and now merely observed the unfolding of an inevitable fate. This absence of emotion was the cruelest of punishments. The daughter longed for a scream, an accusation, anything that could give her a foothold, a way to fight, to defend herself. But the void, the indifference, disarmed her completely. She was invisible to her mother, irrelevant to the universe. The wind howled and the cold intensified, but the daughter no longer felt her body. Her mind was a battlefield where arrogance fought against panic, selfishness against revelation. She tried to scream, but her voice was trapped in her throat, a knot of terror and despair. The smell of earth, of dew, of Monarca, all mingled into a primal fragrance that reminded her of her insignificance, of her disconnection from the natural world she had exploited and disrespected. Monarca, with a slow and deliberate movement, tilted its head slightly to the side as if waiting, not for a reaction, not for a plea, but for an acceptance. The lesson wasn't just about death or life, but about the interconnectedness of all things, about respect for nature, for life, for existence itself. And she, in her selfish pursuit of power, had violated all these laws. The eternity of seconds promised by the night was only just beginning to engrave its lesson upon her soul, and Monarca, with its imposing presence, was the guardian of this terrible and necessary truth. The daughter, at the edge of the abyss, realized that the fall would not be merely physical, but a deep immersion into the darkness of her own soul, a journey of no return for which she was unprepared. But now, what awaited her was not just darkness, but the final revelation of her insignificance, the annihilation of her ego, the dissolution of everything she believed herself to be. Monarca, with a movement that seemed slow and heavy, yet charged with incalculable force, began to move its head. Not to attack, not to push, but for a subtle adjustment, almost a final positioning. Its horns, previously grazing the earth, now aligned with terrifying precision, not with the wheelchair, but with something more, something the daughter, in her paralyzing terror, could not yet discern. It was preparation for the final blow, not the blow that would kill her, but the blow that would seal her fate, that would force her to confront the totality of her destruction. The air vibrated with anticipation, and the night's silence was broken only by the frantic beating of the daughter's heart, a drum of despair echoing in the mountain's vastness. She was at its mercy, a puppet whose strings were being cut one by one, not by a human being, but by the very tapestry of life she had tried to tear. Monarca, with a movement that seemed slow and heavy, yet charged with incalculable force, began to move its head. Not to attack, not to push, but for a subtle adjustment, almost a final positioning. Its horns, previously grazing the earth, now aligned with terrifying precision, not with the wheelchair, but with something more, something the daughter, in her paralyzing terror, could not yet discern. It was preparation for the final blow, not the blow that would kill her, but the blow that would seal her fate. that would force her to confront the totality of her destruction. The air vibrated with anticipation, and the night's silence was broken only by the frantic beating of the daughter's heart, a drum of despair echoing in the mountain's vastness. She was at its mercy, a puppet whose strings were being cut one by one, not by a human being, but by the very tapestry of life she had tried to tear. Then the realization, cold and sharp as the mountain wind, struck her. It wasn't the chair, nor was she the direct target of that alignment. Her eyes, still blurred by tears and panic, followed the imaginary line of Monarcha's horns. And there it was, a few meters away, gleaming under the dying light of dusk. Her car. The luxury SUV, a monument of steel and technology to her own grandiosity, parked arrogantly, as if the world were her private parking lot. That vehicle, more than any jewel or property, was an extension of her persona, the symbol of her power, her impunity, her ability to crush any obstacle. It was her sanctuary, her mobile fortress, the shield that protected her from the world's reality. And now it was in the sights of a force that transcended all human logic. Monarcha let out a deep grunt, a sound that seemed to come from the depths of the earth, laden with millennia of patience and contained fury. Its muscles, previously tense, now contracted in a wave of raw power, a primordial energy that seemed to distort the very air. With a movement that defied gravity and logic, it stepped back, just one, and then, with an explosion of force that made the ground tremble, it charged. It wasn't a run, but a black thunderbolt, a living arrow shot by nature's hand. The daughter couldn't scream. Her voice was trapped, a silent shriek of horror mingling with the wind's howl. Her wide eyes watched, powerless, as her own ruin materialized before her. The impact was cataclysmic, not a noise, but a symphony of destruction. Metal shrieked, a sharp, prolonged cry that seemed to tear the fabric of the night. Glass exploded in a shower of shattered diamonds, falling upon the earth like the tears of an angry god. Monarcha's left horn pierced the fender, ripping the bodywork like paper, while the right buried itself in the hood, crushing the engine with terrifying ease. The car, once a fortress, writhed and groaned, its lights flickering frantically in a final electronic gasp. The cabin, previously pristine, was crushed, the roof caving in like an eggshell under the weight of an invisible hammer. Parts flew, tires burst with a dry bang, and the smell of fuel and burnt oil spread, mingling with the primal aroma of the earth. Monarcha did not stop. With a second, even more powerful headbutt, it tore off the driver's door, flinging it aside like a discarded toy. What remained of the luxury car, a symbol of status and power, was now a twisted mass of metal, plastic, and glass, unrecognizable, disfigured. It was the perfect image of the daughter's empire, grandiose on the outside, but hollow and fragile within, easily undone by the indomitable force of nature she had so disdained. Dust rose, forming a ghostly cloud that enveloped the scene like a shroud over a corpse. The daughter, at the edge of the abyss, felt the ground spin. It wasn't just physical terror, but the annihilation of her identity. The car wasn't merely a material possession, it was her ego, her armor, her escape. Without it, she was naked, exposed, stripped of all pretense. The tears that were once of self-pity were now of pure, overwhelming despair. She had lost everything, not just the inheritance, not just control, but the very illusion of who she was. Monarcha, after its work of destruction, remained motionless, its breathing heavy and rhythmic. There was no triumph in its eyes, only the same ancestral wisdom, the same serene acceptance she had seen in her mother's eyes. The mother in her wheelchair did not avert her gaze. Her stillness was unshakable, her peace, an abyss the daughter could never cross. There was no shock, no surprise, Not even a hint of satisfaction, only the silent observation of a fate unfolding, of a lesson finally being learned. The daughter, her heart beating erratically, looked at the smouldering wreckage of her car, then at the abyss, and finally at Monarca, who seemed to wait. The eternity of seconds promised by the night had transformed into an eternity of ruins, and she, the queen of her own sandcastle, watched her kingdom crumble brick by brick under the impassive gaze of the guardian of truth. The fall would not be merely physical, but the final immersion into the darkness of her own soul, a journey of no return for which now she was painfully prepared. The daughter was painfully prepared, but the preparation was for annihilation, not redemption. The ground beneath her feet, once firm, now seemed to give way, not from physical erosion, but from the dissolution of her own reality. The smell of burnt metal and melted rubber was the incense of her own ruin, and the dust rising from her car's wreckage was the shroud of her ego. She staggered, not from physical imbalance, but from the vertigo of an existential void that swallowed her. Her eyes, still fixed on the smouldering remains of her luxury SUV, no longer saw a car, but the carcass of her own identity. Every twisted piece of metal, every shard of glass, was a fragment of her cruel soul, exposed and shattered. That vehicle, which had been the symbol of her ascent, her power, her escape from mediocrity, was now a monument to her fall, a distorted mirror of her own insignificance. Without it, she was a bird without wings, a queen without a kingdom, a villain without a stage. Monarca, with a slowness that seemed to defy the urgency of the moment, began to move its head, not to attack again, not to push the chair, but for a final gesture of disengagement. Its horns, which for so long had locked the chair's wheels, now moved away with almost surgical precision. The wheelchair miraculously remained motionless, its wheels still stuck in the ground, as if the earth itself refused to allow its fall. Monarca had done its part. The mother was safe, the immediate physical threat neutralized. But the threat to the daughter, that was only just beginning. The black bull, with a deep grunt that resonated through the mountain, turned slowly, its eyes, previously focused on the car's destruction, now fixed on the daughter. There was no anger, no triumph, only an ancestral wisdom, a silent judgment that pierced the soul. It was nature's gaze, impartial and relentless, seeing through all pretensions, all masks, all lies. The daughter felt naked, exposed, every flaw, every cruelty, every selfish thought, laid bare under that ancient gaze. She tried to avert her gaze, but couldn't. It was as if she were trapped, hypnotized by the brutal truth Monarca represented. She sought her mother, a last refuge, a last hope for condemnation or forgiveness that could give meaning to that hell. But her mother, in her wheelchair, remained in her unshakable stillness, her eyes fixed on the horizon, as if she had already seen it all, as if the drama before her was merely the inevitable conclusion of a long-written play. Her serenity was not indifference, but a profound acceptance, a peace the daughter would never know. This absence of emotion in her mother was the cruelest punishment of all. There were no screams, no tears, not even a sigh of relief, only silence, an abyss of indifference the daughter could not cross. She was invisible to her mother, irrelevant to the universe. The revelation struck her like lightning. It wasn't the inheritance, not the power, not the luxury she had lost. It was the connection to her mother, to nature, to humanity itself. She had isolated herself in her tower of selfishness, and now the tower had crumbled. A scream tore from the daughter's throat, but it wasn't a cry of rage or despair. It was a primordial sound, a lament of loss, of regret, of a pain deeper than any physical wound. She fell to her knees, not in supplication, but in collapse. Her body, once stiff with arrogance, was now a heap of muscles and bones, unable to bear the weight of her own soul. Tears streamed down, mixing with dust and soot, washing away expensive makeup, revealing the raw face of terror and desolation. The fall wasn't physical. It wasn't about the abyss. It was a deep immersion into the darkness of her own soul, a journey of no return for which she, now, was painfully prepared. Her mind, once a labyrinth of plans and ambitions, transformed into a field of ruins, where the echoes of her own cruel acts reverberated ceaselessly. She was alive, yes, but it was a life not worth living, an existence condemned to relive the horror of that moment, an eternity of seconds that would stretch throughout her entire life. Monarcha, its mission accomplished, did not wait. With a slow and majestic movement, it turned and walked back into the pasture, passing through the broken fence as if it had never existed. Its imposing silhouette disappeared into the night's darkness, leaving behind only the smell of damp earth, the echo of destruction, and the lesson etched into the daughter's soul. The mother in her wheelchair remained motionless, a beacon of peace amidst the desolation. Her eyes still fixed on the horizon, watching the rise of a new dawn, which would bring with it not forgiveness, but inevitable consequence. The daughter, an inert body at the foot of the mountain, was now a monument to her own cruelty, a silent reminder that nature, in its relentless wisdom, always finds a way to restore balance. The abyss, once a threat, was now a metaphor for the vastness of the void that consumed her. And so, under the indifferent gaze of the stars, the night delivered the mountain to daylight, revealing the scene of a destiny fulfilled, of a justice that, though delayed, was absolute. The inheritance, the power, the luxury, all turned to dust, and what remained was only the naked truth, the cruelest of punishments.